Hi. This week I'm talking about magic, in magic in the 20th century. This is a new unit for me. I'm putting it together, so I don't know that it's where I want it to be right now as a lecture, and as a unit, but I want to give it a go. And please, in the end, if you feel like I can, there's some things I should add or adjust, just let me know. Um, it's also a departure in a couple of other ways. Um, uh, I have to reach beyond the time span that we're dealing with. I'm going to be talking about the 20th century, but I'm going to give you a little from before the 20th century in order to give some context to it, and also magic reaches beyond the boundaries of most countries, and it still does. There's a lot of exchange about magic that happens across borders. Obviously, the internet has sped that along, so that magicians from all different countries exchange techniques and talk and share and critique each other and so on. This still goes on, and it went on before. So I have to be able to do that in order to talk about it a little bit. Still, I'm just going to give a broad outline of what happened in the country with the performance of magic as entertainment. I am talking about the entertainment of magic and not Wiccans and so on who might deal with magic in another way. Um, so that being said, just one other thing. You'll see in the unit on Google Classroom that I'm posting some videos and so on, and I'll designate certain ones that are required reading and viewing rather, and others that are there for you to get an idea of what certain performers do, particularly those in the latter part of the 20th century, the last 25 years of the century. And don't feel you have to watch those all the way through. Of course, you may if you want to, but they're there to give you a flavor of the kind of work that those magicians do. So that being said, let me share my screen. If I can figure out where that needs to be. Here we go. And let's talk about magic in the 20th century. So there's a couple of different ways that we can kind of divide things up in the 20th century. We could look at important innovators, and we can also look at the great entertainers, and we could look at the entertainers who were also innovators. Mostly because of the way we're dealing with this course, it's the great entertainers first who are important. There will be some reading around some innovation, uh, uh, but because we're talking about entertainment, we're not talking about the development of the craft as much as we're talking about kind of the movement of it as an entertainment area. Um, Sorry about that. Magic has a somewhat special place in the world of entertainment, um, because it is not just a simple, straightforward matter of deception. In the theater, we talk about the willing suspension of disbelief, and it operates a little differently in with magic. Uh, so I have a quote here from the book, The Secret History of Magic, by Lamont and Steinmeier. Um, uh, and I'll come back to Steinmeier in a minute, Jim Steinmeier. But I want to read this quote for you. I don't know how this is going to work because it's partially blocked for me. So I'm going to move my little picture there. I don't know if that comes through either, but we'll give it a try. So he wrote, magic then is not a simple deception. It is, in fact, a unique form of deception. Other forms of deception work because you do not realize you are being deceived. After all, If you know that someone is lying, then you will not believe them. In magic, however, the audience knows that they are being deceived, but they believe what they see. They do not believe in magic, but they do believe what they see. Paul Gertner, who's a working magician still today, has a one-man show that's running in Boston, puts it this way in that show. If you think about it, magic is truly one of the world's most honest professions because we tell you we are going to lie to you, and then we keep our word. So, the first successful magician in the United States was Richard Potter. And I really want to go back to Richard Potter for a very important reason. Potter, besides the fact that he was born in Hopkinton, which makes him a Massachusetts native and a kind of local boy, was born to an enslaved mother. So he was African American. His father was most likely the owner of his mother. And yet he was able to become a quite successful entertainer in the early part of the 19th century. In those days, ventriloquism and magic were pretty closely linked. Ventriloquism was somewhat of a fad. People liked ventriloquism. So he learned ventriloquism, throwing his voice, and he also learned magic when he was in England. And then he learned his craft and he came back to the United States and he toured here with his wife. And as I say, became quite successful, bought a farm in New Hampshire, had a lovely home there, was a very popular magician, and was even rumored to have toured in the South, as well as performing in Boston and New York and Philadelphia. As to whether he actually toured in the South or not, I'm not sure, but that rumor kind of floats out there in the histories. His most popular trick was called the enchanted egg, and it was an egg that would kind of hop from one place to another and appear in various places. So some kind of version of sleight of hand is what was going on. Historically, then, from there, magic kind of grew out of minstrel shows, and a lot of American entertainment did. I cover minstrel shows in TH 270, so that's History of American Entertainment 1. There's my shameless plug for the first part of this course. And minstrel shows, for those of you who don't know, were developed by white performers in which they impersonated Black performers, but they impersonated stereotypes of Black performers. So they would use blackface, and the stereotypes were quite racist. And yet it was the wellspring of music and comedy and other kinds of performance through the 19th century, well into the 20th century, and you can trace a lot of performance style back to them, including musical theater, stand-up comedy, and so on, has roots in minstrel shows. The minstrel shows contained a variety section called the Olio, and out of that grew vaudeville, and variety shows that eventually went into radio and television. So it really has a lot. Now, the magic would have appeared during the Olio. Out of that grew what we call the Big Magic Show, in which magicians performed put on one show and people would come and see it. So rather than doing an act in a variety show, these magicians would do a much bigger show with many magic acts, and perhaps there'd be dancing, and there might be animal acts, and it would be a big show, right? And there would be the great man in in magic. The leading magician in the country was there, doing it. Keller, who's pictured here, was the leading magician at the end of the 19th century during what we call the golden age of magic. From there, it moved into vaudeville, which were variety shows that happened all across the country, and nightclubs. So eventually, the big magic show kind of dwindled, and the magicians appeared more in vaudeville, and I'll cover that a little bit. It moved from there into television, a little bit into radio, but radio obviously has no pictures, so it's pretty hard. It moved into television. It moved back to stage towards the end of the 20th century, and eventually became a bigger presence on television than it was during the middle of the 20th century. And we will see that culture change that happened in the 60s had an impact on it. One of the things that made all of this kind of interesting for me was that I could have a sense of what was happening in the beginning of the 20th century. And I certainly understood what was happening at the end of the 20th century, but the middle of the 20th century, from really post World War II to the mid 70s, was a little blurry in my mind. And I read a couple of histories. I mentioned this book, The Secret History of Magic, by Lamont and Steinmeier. And I also read another book by Jim Steinmeier, Vanishing the Elephant. Hiding the Elephant. And I thought maybe Jim Steinmeier would have some thoughts on this. So I actually found his website and I wrote him an email. And surprisingly, he wrote me back within an hour and a half, a quite lengthy email talking about, from his point of view, kind of what happened in the history of magic. And he referred to those years of the 50s and the 60s as the doldrums, the slow period. So my impression that it was kind of a little fuzzy what was going on there is really borne out. There was magic on television, but there wasn't a big splash, is what he was saying. The other thing I want to touch on, and this goes to across the ocean, is that there was a connection between magic and film in the early 20th century. David Devant, who eventually became the great man of magic in England, saw the Lumiere brothers' early films and realized immediately that there was the opportunity to create magic with this new device. But he was working at that time for another magician who wasn't interested. So Devant gave a projector to his friend Georges Méliès in France. And you may remember Méliès for his movie, The Voyage to the Moon. Well, Méliès was actually a stage magician. He was, at that time, he had a magic theater where he performed. And the story is that he kind of stumbled upon the jump cut, that there was that if you stopped the film and started it again, that in between time of action is removed, and from that you could create magic. So what he was really doing in his movies was an extension of what he did on stage. He created magic with film. So where does that leave us in terms of the United States? Here in the United States, we did have the history of the big man, the great man of magic. As I mentioned, it was Keller towards the end of the 19th century. And Keller was not an innovator. He actually stole a lot of his act, and that's well documented. He would go to England and he would watch people do it, and he would do their acts, and he'd figure out what they did. In fact, at one point he actually went up on stage during somebody's show and looked at what they were doing so that he could then come back and duplicate it in the United States. However, he was a great showman. He was a great entertainer. He was hugely popular and very, very successful. And as he was getting older and he was looking at retirement, a younger man came along who had a rather rough upbringing, and really could have gone down the road to crime from what he himself said, and that was Howard Thurston. And Keller essentially sold Thurston his act, and Thurston built it into an even bigger act. So his act included elements of circus, and it had an orchestra and dancing girls and as many as 36 different magic acts. He would travel by train. It was a huge amount of equipment that he had. He was flamboyant and extravagant, and it was a great spectacle. It's great for families. He focused on children, and he really kind of heralds the end of that golden age of magic that I mentioned. Now, his greatest rival at the time was Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini was an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant from Hungary. Though at times he claimed that he was born in the United States, but he wasn't. And he started out doing both magic and an escape act, and he worked in vaudeville as opposed to Thurston, who had his own show on stage, The Big Show. Houdini worked in vaudeville, and vaudeville was hugely popular across the country. So once he became part of the Orpheum circuit, and there were different circuits in the country. He became part of the Orpheum circuit. He could travel the country and perform at the Orpheum theaters in towns and cities, really across the continent. It was recommended to him that he drop the magic and that he focus on the escape act, and that was his ticket to fame. It really was. And we know his name today. We're all very much aware of the name of Houdini, even if we haven't seen any of his. There is some Houdini in the video that you can watch. He would publicize his performances in the cities by doing a free escape or a free trick out in public, and people could see it. And that's what many of the videos show of him working. It is there from film news footage, actually, of his performance, and therefore he'd sell tickets. Later in his career, he tried to revive a magic act and do it as a great show all by himself. It didn't go well. He was not well received by audience or the critics. But he remained extremely popular. Unfortunately, Houdini died early. I won't go into the whole story, but it was a very unfortunate incident that ended with him having a ruptured appendix, and he died. His greatest act was the water trick, the water cabinet, which you can see over here, was a big escape. And there are people who still do that act today. In fact, Penn and Teller, who I'll talk about later, do their own version of the water cabinet. So Houdini dies in the 1920s, the mid 1920s. Magic continues really into the 1930s. Of course, the 1930s, with the Great Depression, people are going less to see things, and radio is really as we know, became a much bigger entertainment vehicle for people, because they could bring it into their own homes, and it was much more affordable. And magic didn't really fare well there, but vaudeville was still big, and magic moved into vaudeville, where you could do your 15 or 20-minute act, and maybe 10 minutes if you weren't a headliner, and it still was alive. It kind of adapted as an entertainment form. And vaudeville after World War II was really kind of brought into television as variety shows. And those variety shows lasted well into the 1970s. So a good 25, 30 years of variety shows on television. And magic was there, and was presented. And there were quite a number of quite good magicians, but it was not a comfortable relationship because you lose some of the wonder, and you, particularly in the earlier days of television, there was no way for the audience to know if what they saw was actually being performed, or whether there was trick camera work involved. That's something that television and magic has worked very hard to correct in the 21st century. So it was not a great relationship. However, there were some interesting people who came along. Dai Vernon really revolutionized card handling. He brought the actual techniques of card cheats into magic. And he taught a lot of people. His nickname was the Professor. Cardini did a sophisticated drunk act and was a beautiful card handler. Blackstone somewhat inherited the mantle of the great man, but he was also trapped by television, so he couldn't make the big splash that say Thurston did earlier. And even performers from other countries like Slidini would perform here, and Slidini was gorgeous work that he would do. Then in the mid-1970s, along came a Canadian named Doug Henning. And he took on the mantle of the great man of magic. He had a show on Broadway, and that led to television specials. So we would perform on Broadway and do a television special a year. It was a big deal. His special would come up. There would be stars involved. And I think I posted a video of one of those early ones, 75 or 76. There were elements of musical theater involved in it. Large spectacle. He did close-up magic. Very high production values. But I think mostly the reason that he was successful where others of similar talent had not been was that he changed with the times. The uniform of the magician from the mid-19th century had become the tuxedo. And with the change in the 1960s, there was a big rejection of kind of that old, more conservative idea of performing that way. And here we have Doug Henning in a jumpsuit and looking very 1970s with long hair and his mustache. And he wasn't a hippie, but he was charming, and he was very interested in the audience achieving a sense of wonder. He lasted through the into the 1980s, and then he left the business and actually went to study transcendental meditation. He was replaced as the great man of magic by David Copperfield. Copperfield, easily the most financially successful magician in history. Big show again, much like Thurston, though without the dancing. It's just big, spectacular magic. He can do the close-up, but he specialized in big acts, like even sawing himself in half rather than someone else. And in fact, his illusions got bigger and bigger until he's disappearing a jumbo jet. He's disappearing the Statue of Liberty. He's walking through the Great Wall of China. And our friend Jim Steinmeier, as well as being an author and historian of magic, develops magic tricks with magicians, and he worked with Copperfield on some of that. He also worked with Doug Henning on some of his shows. At the same time, coming up were this duo of Penn and Teller, and you may have heard of them. You may even be familiar with them now. Their current show is Penn and Teller Fool Us. They established themselves as the bad boys of magic. You can see they're not wearing tuxedos in this. They always wear three-piece suits in their work, but their wearing of suits is ironic because they come from a background that's really street magic, and they're much more in your face, and they're much more likely to do things that are going to be gross, seemingly dangerous. And they, among other reasons they call themselves the bad boys of magic, is that they reveal secrets, or at least they purport to reveal secrets, because often what they reveal seems really cool when they show you how it's done. But sometimes they'll reveal it and they'll do it again, and you still can't figure out how they did what they did. They're beautiful performers. Their act, along with sort of the gross and dangerous stuff and a lot of humor, their act is very funny. They're known for the fact that Penn Jillette, who's extremely tall, never shuts up, and Teller never speaks during the act. They did a lot of television. They had television shows. They were on Letterman a lot, the Tonight Show. They were kind of everywhere. Then at the end of the century, we have David Blaine comes along. And Blaine kind of brings us full circle from Potter in the beginning. Potter being a performer of color, and Blaine is a performer of color. Blaine is part Puerto Rican, part Jewish. He too started out in street magic, but rather than being a kind of in-your-face guy, he's very cool and he's very hip and he's very understated in what he does. He understands the street. He grew up in Brooklyn and in New Jersey, and he understands that world. And he built his understanding of that into doing magic, where he eventually could work parties, and the parties he went to became more expensive parties, and he became friends with movie stars, and he built that into quite a career. His first show on television was a street magic show in which it was more like reality TV, but it was real. It wasn't scripted. He would stop people on the street and perform magic for them, or do magic in their homes. So you can see him doing both. And he's not so much an innovator in those, but a very, very skilled magician doing close-up work. He moved from that to doing more physical endurance and danger acts, trying to take on the mantle of Houdini in what he did. He did the bullet catch. The bullet catch is actually a dangerous trick. There are people who have died from the bullet catch. Penn and Teller do the bullet catch, but Blaine encased himself in ice, and he tried to break the record for holding breath underwater. So big kind of spectacle the way Houdini did. And that kind of brings us to the end of the 20th century. With magic. So it takes this swing from being a big stage production with Thurston into vaudeville with Houdini, and then kind of quiets down in television and only appears occasionally without any big household names popping up until we get to the last quarter century, and these magicians start a new movement, essentially, of magic. It's got a firmer hold on television now than it did before, but that's because I think of the diversity on television is much, much greater. Anyway, that's it for magic. I hope you found it interesting. Take a look at the readings that are there, because you may have noticed, I don't want to forget this, you may have noticed I'm not showing you any performers of color until we get to David Blaine. They did exist, but not prominently. and I'm not showing you women in magic. And that's been a real loss. There were successful women in magic in the early part of the century, and I've got a video explaining one of those for you. And there are certainly women in magic now. And I've got a little bit of a video that talks about that for you. So we don't want to forget that the fact that it's a white guy club, there's a reason for that, and one of the readings will kind of give you some entree into how that happened in the early part of the century. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot, and on to the discussion.